The town was barely that. 3 buildings, a sagging church with no bell, and a saloon that doubled as a boarding house and tripled as a place no decent woman should linger near. The wind came through like it meant to scrape flesh from bone, carrying dust and the promise of snow too early in the season. Rebecca Coleman kept her hands tucked into the folds of her threadbare shawl, her belly swollen under the fabric, her back aching from the miles behind her, and the silence that always grew heavier when she neared men. 2 children flanked her, their cheeks pink from cold, their eyes darting at shadows. Emma, barely 8, held her younger brother's hand like she was already old. Tommy was 5 and hadn't spoken in 3 days. They'd left Kansas 2 weeks before the frost came in, left because her husband had died on the wrong end of a banker's rifle, and because the preacher in town had said it was improper for a woman alone to keep farming land that was no longer legally hers. Improper. Like grief had a code of conduct, she'd hitched a ride as far as the cattleman's route would take her, then walked the rest relying on kindness that came with strings or not at all. But this town, God help her, this town had one thing no other place dared offer: a man for sale. It wasn't slavery, not really. That had died with the war. This was different. A notice had gone up weeks prior, nailed to a post like scripture in splinters. Mounted man seeks lawful employment, willing to trade service for shelter through winter. $1 contract, terms negotiable, no questions asked. Most folks in town had laughed, said if a man couldn't earn his keep the hard way, he wasn't worth the firewood he'd split. But Rebecca saw it for what it was, an answer, not just to her hunger or her children's shivering frames, but to the unbearable silence that crept closer each day. A man in the house meant protection, meant maybe they'd make it through to spring. The deal was struck without ceremony. One folded dollar handed to a man who looked more bare than human. Broad shoulders under a wool coat worn smooth in places, a beard thick and black, streaked with early gray. Eyes the color of winter sky beneath the brim of a slouch hat. He didn't speak much, didn't smile either, just looked at her, at the children, and nodded once. "What's your name?" she asked as they loaded her few belongings into a borrowed wagon, one wheel cracked, one child coughing. The man paused, then said, "Reckon you'll know it soon enough." They left the town behind before dusk, the road winding between brittle trees and forgotten fences. The silence between them wasn't tense. It was weighty, like something waiting to drop. The wagon creaked beneath them, and the mountain rose in the distance like the back of some sleeping beast. It was cold enough to make breath steam and fingers numb, but still Rebecca didn't speak again. She was saving her words, saving everything. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, they arrived at the cabin. It was bigger than she'd expected. 2 rooms, a loft, smoke already trailing from the chimney. Whoever he was, he hadn't lied about having shelter. He helped her down without touching her, his movements careful, deliberate. Inside the cabin was sparse but warm. A fire crackled low, and the smell of venison stew lingered in the air like memory. He showed her the cot, the hearth, the shelf of preserved goods and dried herbs. He didn't explain anything. He didn't need to. The children fell asleep almost instantly, curled together beneath quilts that smelled of pine and wood smoke. Rebecca sat near the fire, staring at the flames until her belly shifted and reminded her what she carried. He spoke then, from the shadows. "You're too thin for a woman that far along." She didn't jump, just nodded. "Been walking too long. You got a plan for the birth?" "No." Her voice cracked. "Do you?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Midwife's a week south. Snow comes early. You won't reach her." Rebecca met his eyes, and for the first time something moved in them. Not pity, not desire, recognition maybe. She said nothing more, and neither did he. That night she lay awake long after the fire dimmed, listening to the wind whistle through cracks in the logs and the steady breathing of the man who had no name. She wondered if she'd made a mistake, if a woman alone could ever afford to trust. But trust wasn't what this was. This was survival. In the morning she found him outside splitting wood, his breath misting in the cold. The children were still asleep. She stood on the porch watching him, her shawl wrapped tight. When he saw her, he didn't stop, just spoke between strikes. You got a strong back for someone carrying three. She didn't correct him. The baby counted, even if it wasn't walking yet. You got a name? He asked after a moment. Rebecca. She hesitated. Rebecca Coleman. He froze, axe mid-swing. His eyes met hers, sharp and suddenly awake. Rebecca Coleman. She felt the blood drain from her face. How do you know that? He lowered the axe slowly, not answering right away. Then, quiet as the snow settling around them, he said, because you prayed my name once, and I heard it. She staggered back a step, hand flying to her belly as if to shield herself. He didn't move, didn't explain, but his face held something she hadn't seen in a long, long time. Certainty. Inside, the children stirred. Outside, the sky darkened with snow again, and Rebecca Coleman realized that some debts can never be paid. They can only be returned to the one who saved your soul. Rebecca didn't speak. She stood frozen on the edge of the porch, breath shallow, eyes locked on the man who'd just unraveled her name from his lips like he'd carried it for years. Her mind scrambled through memory, faces, voices, names, but his wasn't there. He wasn't there. And yet something in the way he'd said it made her knees weaken and her stomach turn. Not with fear, but with a strange, echoing familiarity that struck deep. He didn't press her, didn't look away either, just turned back to the chopping block, drove the axe down once more, splitting a thick log with a clean crack that broke the silence like a bone. Inside, the children were stirring. She heard Tommy's sleepy whimper and Emma's soft hush in response. Rebecca blinked and pulled herself together, stepping back into the cabin and closing the door behind her. The warmth inside felt thinner than it had the night before, or maybe it was just her nerves unraveling. Emma rubbed her eyes, hair a tangle of straw and sleep. Mama, where are we? Rebecca knelt and pulled both children close. Somewhere safe, she whispered, though the words didn't sit right in her mouth. They were true, maybe, or maybe just hopeful. Later, while the children sat near the fire eating from chipped bowls filled with watered-down stew, Rebecca stood at the window watching him. He moved like the mountain itself, silent, immovable, necessary. But now her eyes traced the details she'd missed in the urgency of cold and need. The old scar on his knuckles, the way he looked toward the ridge every time the wind shifted, like he expected something or someone to come over it. When he finally returned, arms full of split wood, she stepped aside without a word. He stacked the pieces near the hearth, brushed snow from his shoulders, and sat at the small table like it was a chore he'd been avoiding. Rebecca ladled the last of the stew into a bowl and set it before him. He ate without looking up, hands steady, movements slow. You said I prayed your name, she said, voice low. He swallowed, set the spoon down, and looked at her. You did. I don't remember. You were 17, behind a burned-out chapel outside Millerville. You were bleeding. She felt the air vanish from her lungs. Her hand found the edge of the table to steady herself. That was, she started, then stopped. She hadn't spoken of that night in 10 years, not to anyone. She'd thought it had died with the old timber walls and the man who'd run off and left her there. I wasn't there by accident, he said. I found you. You don't remember me because I didn't let you. She stared at him, heart thundering. Why? Because I was running too. There it was. No dramatics, no explanation, just that simple sentence. And suddenly her knees couldn't hold her. She sank onto the bench across from him, eyes burning. You left me, she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. I saved you, he answered, and there was something hard in his voice now. Carried you to the widow Hayes's farm, told her you needed a doctor, and then I left. Why? He looked past her, then toward the flames. Because I wasn't ready to be seen. Silence stretched between them like a fault line, deep and full of things neither of them could name. The children were still eating, oblivious to the tension unraveling like old twine. She couldn't reconcile it, the memory of pain and fire and blood, the desperate prayer she'd whispered into the ashes, and the man before her now. But something in his eyes made her believe it. He wasn't lying. That part she knew in her bones. What's your name? She asked. His gaze met hers. Jake Morgan. It hit her like a thunderclap. She hadn't heard that name in over a decade, but she knew it from the stories that drifted through towns like smoke. Jake Morgan, the mountain man who'd vanished into the high country after some tragedy no one could quite name. Some said he'd lost his family to sickness. Others swore he'd killed a man in self-defense and couldn't live with it. No one ever knew what parts were true, and yet here he was, building fires and chopping wood like redemption could be earned one splinter at a time. "You shouldn't have told me," she said, voice barely a whisper. "I know." She wanted to be angry, wanted to demand why he'd waited, why he hadn't spoken sooner. But all she could feel was the press of time, the weight of years between them, and the way her unborn child turned in her belly like it too could feel the shift in the room. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up again, and the old cabin creaked like it was remembering storms of years past. She lay on her side, back aching, one hand resting on her stomach. Across the room, Jake sat near the dying fire, carving something from a block of pine. The scraping sound was slow and even, calming in a way, like the ticking of a clock that had never stopped for either of them. "You said you were running," she said into the dark. He paused, the carving knife stilled. "I was." "From what?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Myself, and from what I couldn't save." She didn't press. She knew what it meant to carry shame too heavy for words. Instead, she turned her face toward the wall and let the sound of his knife lull her toward sleep. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Jake chopped wood, hunted what game he could find in the early snow, and stayed quiet. The children began to soften toward him. Emma asked him about the trees, about the best way to track deer in snow. Tommy followed him around in silence, mimicking his steps, the way he held tools, even the way he breathed. Jake never pushed, never raised his voice, but slowly, without her even noticing, the cabin began to feel more like a home. Rebecca washed clothes in melted snow, cooked meals from whatever Jake brought in, and tried not to think about the past. But every now and then, she'd catch him watching her. Not in the way men used to watch when they thought they had a right, but like he was trying to remember something he hadn't quite lost. One night, when the fire was low and the children already asleep, he spoke. "I didn't know it was you," he said. "Not when I put up the notice." She looked up from her mending. "But you remembered." "Only after you said your name." She nodded slowly. "Why did you leave again, after saving me?" His hands tightened around the carving. "Because I was half a man back then. I thought if I stayed, I'd ruin you. And now, I ain't sure what I am now," he said quietly. "But I know I wouldn't leave again." There it was, a promise he hadn't spoken before, a thread woven quiet between them. But fate has a way of listening in when you start to believe in peace. It happened 2 mornings later. Jake had gone to check his trap lines, snares he'd set for rabbits and ptarmigan in the valleys below. Rebecca was pulling blankets from the loft when she heard something that made her blood run cold. Not the bark of Jake's old hound that sometimes followed him into the woods. Not the creak of settling timber. Hoofbeats. She ran to the window, heart pounding. Riders, 3 of them, cresting the ridge like shadows on horseback. Her breath caught. They weren't townsmen, weren't drifters. These men wore purpose like armor, and even from a distance, she could see the glint of rifles slung across their backs. One of them, the tall one in the lead, had a face she thought she recognized. Her stomach dropped. Jake returned minutes later, rifle in hand, eyes already hard. "You know them?" he asked. She nodded, voice dry. "The tall one's Emmett Kane. He rode with the men who killed my husband." Jake's jaw clenched. "They here for you or me?" "Both?" she asked. "Both," he said without hesitation. The children were behind her, silent, wide-eyed. She looked at Jake, really looked, and for the first time, fear didn't curl in her chest. Not because the danger wasn't real, but because for the first time, she didn't feel alone. The riders didn't charge. They circled the ridge like buzzards waiting for death to do its work, their silhouettes cut against the pale sky, dark and still, horses restless beneath them. Jake moved to the rifle rest by the window, checking his ammunition with the practiced calm of a man who'd done this before. "What do we do?" Rebecca whispered. Jake's answer was simple. We wait. And in the growing darkness, Rebecca realized that sometimes the past doesn't just follow you. Sometimes it comes with guns drawn, ready to collect what it thinks you owe. The riders didn't approach that first day. They stayed on the ridge like sentinels, close enough to be seen, but far enough to avoid rifle range. Jake moved through the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd lived too long in wild places. He checked every window, every board, every angle where a bullet might find its way through. Rebecca watched him work, her hand unconsciously resting on her belly. This wasn't the careful, deliberate mountain man who chopped wood that morning. This was someone else entirely, someone who moved like he'd been born expecting trouble. They're not going to rush us, Jake said, peering through a gap in the shutters. Men like that want you afraid before they want you dead. How do you know? Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jake's eyes met hers, and for the first time since he'd said her name on the porch, she saw a flicker of something in him that reminded her why mountain men stayed in the mountains. Because I used to know men like that. Emma sat close to her mother, clutching her rag doll. Tommy had gone quiet again, the way he did when the world felt too big and dangerous. Rebecca pulled them both close, her voice steady despite the thunder in her chest. Are they bad men, Mama? Emma whispered. Rebecca didn't lie. Yes. Jake glanced at the door again, then knelt beside the children. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. But they don't know these mountains like I do, and they don't know what your mama's made of. He looked at Rebecca when he said it, and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. As dusk fell, Jake moved like a ghost through the trees around the cabin. Rebecca watched from the window as he disappeared and reappeared in the shadows, setting what looked like thin wire between the pines. When he returned, his hand smelled of pine sap and metal. What were you doing out there? She asked. Making sure we hear them coming, he said simply. Mountain tricks, bells and tripwires. Sound carries different up here, if you know how to listen. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Jake sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, while Rebecca tried to rest on the cot with the children curled against her. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the eaves made her heart jump. Near midnight, Jake spoke softly into the darkness. I need to tell you about Emmett Kane. Rebecca turned toward his voice. You know him? We rode together years back, before I came to the mountains. Jake's voice was heavy with old regret. Before I found you in that chapel. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the children. What happened? Jake was quiet for a long moment. We robbed a bank in Silverton. It was supposed to be simple. In and out, no one gets hurt. But things went wrong. There was a family in the bank, a woman with a little girl. Kane wanted to. He stopped, jaw clenched. I wouldn't let him. Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. So you fought. I shot 2 of his men. Kane swore he'd kill me for it, but I got away. Jake's knuckles were white around the rifle stock. I've been running from that moment ever since. Is that why you left me? After the chapel? He nodded. I couldn't stay. Couldn't bring that kind of trouble to someone I... He stopped himself. Someone you what? She asked softly. Jake looked at her across the dark cabin, and in his eyes was something raw and honest. Someone I'd already started to love. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Rebecca felt her breath catch, not from shock, but from recognition. Because somewhere in the years between that night and this one, she'd started to understand that the prayer she'd whispered in the ashes hadn't been for salvation. It had been for him. Before she could respond, a sound cut through the night, thin and metallic like a bell struck by wind. Jake was on his feet instantly. They're moving, he whispered. Rebecca gathered the children, her heart hammering. Tommy, Emma, remember what we practiced. Under the table, quiet as mice. Jake moved to the window, rifle ready. Another bell rang, closer this time. Then a third. How many? Rebecca asked, checking the load on the old shotgun Jake had given her. 3, maybe 4. Coming from the east. His voice was calm, professional. They think the darkness will help them. Will it? Jake smiled grimly. Not against a mountain man. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack that sent splinters flying from the doorframe. Rebecca dropped to the floor, pulling the children closer. Jake returned fire immediately, the muzzle flash lighting up the cabin like lightning. "Stay down," he shouted, working the rifle's lever. "They're testing us, seeing how many guns we have." Another shot punched through the shutters, burying itself in the far wall. Emma whimpered, but Tommy stayed silent, his small face set with determination that reminded Rebecca painfully of his father. Jake moved like smoke through the cabin, firing from different windows to make it seem like there were more defenders. His mountain training showed in every movement. He knew how to use the terrain, the darkness, the echo of gunshots off stone to his advantage. "Rebecca!" a voice called from outside. Emmett Kane's voice, smooth and mocking. "I know you're in there. Come out and we'll make this quick." Jake's face went hard as winter. "Don't answer him." "We know about your husband," Kane continued. "Know about the money he hid before we killed him. You tell us where it is, maybe we let the children live." Rebecca's blood turned to ice. "There is no money," she whispered to Jake. "Doesn't matter," Jake replied grimly. "Men like Kane don't need truth. They just need excuses." The assault intensified. Shots came from three sides now, forcing Jake to move constantly. Rebecca huddled over the children, shotgun ready, watching the windows for any sign of movement. Then, in a lull between gunshots, she heard it. The soft scrape of boots on wood. Someone was climbing onto the roof. Jake heard it too. He looked up at the ceiling, tracking the sound. "Back room," he mouthed silently. "Now!" They moved as quietly as shadows, Rebecca carrying Tommy, while Emma clung to her skirt. Just as they reached the back room, the front door exploded inward. Kane stepped through the smoking doorway, revolver drawn, two men flanking him. He was older than Rebecca remembered, grizzled and lean, with eyes like chips of flint. "Well, well," he drawled, scanning the empty main room. "Jake Morgan. Been a long time." Jake emerged from the shadows like a mountain cat. Rifle trained on Kane's chest. "Not long enough." Kane smiled, but his gun never wavered. "You cost me a lot of money in Silverton. A lot of good men, too." "Those men chose their path," Jake said coldly. "Same as you." "Maybe so." Kane's eyes flicked toward the back room. "But now you got yourself a family to worry about. Changes things, doesn't it?" Rebecca stepped into view, shotgun raised. Kane's smile widened. "Rebecca Coleman," he said, like greeting an old friend. "Still pretty, even carrying another man's child. Your husband squealed like a pig when we shot him, you know. Kept crying about some buried gold that didn't exist." Rebecca's finger tightened on the trigger. "You're lying." "Am I?" Kane shrugged. "Doesn't matter now. What matters is you're going to tell us where that gold is, or we're going to start with the children." Jake took one step forward. "Over my dead body." Kane's laugh was like breaking glass. "That can be arranged." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Rebecca could feel her heart beating in her throat, could hear Emma's quiet breathing behind her. Everything balanced on the edge of a knife. Then Tommy stepped out from behind his mother, small and quiet and brave beyond his years. "My papa didn't have any gold," he said, his voice clear and steady. "He just had us." Kane looked down at the boy, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance. In that moment of distraction, Jake moved. The rifle roared. Kane spun sideways, his shoulder exploding in red. His men raised their weapons, but Rebecca was already firing, the shotgun's blast catching one in the chest. Jake worked his lever, fired again, and the second man dropped. Kane rolled behind the overturned table, clutching his wounded shoulder. "This isn't over, Morgan," he snarled. "I got more men coming. You can't protect them forever." Jake stepped forward, rifle aimed at the table. "Maybe not forever, but I can protect them tonight." A long silence stretched. Then came the sound of boots retreating, a door slamming, horses galloping away into the darkness. Jake lowered his rifle, breathing hard. Rebecca set down the shotgun with shaking hands. The children ran to her, and she pulled them close, finally allowing herself to tremble. "Is it over?" Emma asked. Jake looked out the shattered window at the empty ridge. "Not yet," he said quietly. but we won this round. Rebecca met his eyes across the smoke-filled cabin. What now? Jake checked his rifle, reloading with practiced movements. Now we get ready, because tomorrow they'll come back with everything they have. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the broken door, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of harder battles to come. But inside the cabin, 4 people stood together, no longer strangers, no longer alone. And for the first time since this all began, Rebecca Coleman felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Dawn came gray and bitter, the sky heavy with snow that hadn't yet decided to fall. Jake stood at the shattered window, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the ridge where shadows moved like wolves testing the edges of a camp. They were still out there. More of them now. Kane hadn't been bluffing. Rebecca moved carefully around the cabin, gathering what supplies she could while keeping one hand pressed to her lower back. The baby had been restless all night, turning and pressing against her ribs like it sensed the danger gathering outside. How many? She asked, joining Jake at the window. 6, maybe 7. His voice was grim. Kane brought reinforcements. Emma helped Tommy stack the remaining firewood against the damaged door while Jake wedged chairs and boards against the windows. Every action was deliberate, methodical, the kind of preparation that came from knowing death was patient but persistent. They're not going to wait much longer, Jake said, checking his ammunition. Kane's shoulders bleeding, and wounded men get desperate. Rebecca felt a sharp pain lance through her belly, gone so quickly she almost dismissed it. Almost. But then it came again, stronger this time, and she gripped the edge of the table. Jake saw it immediately. Rebecca! I'm fine, she said through gritted teeth, but they both knew she was lying. Another pain hit, and this time she couldn't hide the gasp that escaped her lips. Jake was beside her in an instant, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. It's too early, she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Jake's jaw set like stone. Fear can bring labor early, especially after what we've been through. A rifle shot cracked from the ridge, the bullet thudding into the cabin wall. Then another. Kane was testing their defenses, probing for weakness. I can't have this baby now, Rebecca said, her voice breaking. Not like this. Not with them out there. Jake cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me. You're the strongest woman I know. You survived losing your husband, walked hundreds of miles with 2 children, and last night you faced down 3 armed men without flinching. Another contraction gripped her, and she doubled over. Jake held her steady. I can't protect you if I'm... she started. You won't be helpless, Jake interrupted. This is what women have been doing since the beginning of time. Your body knows what to do. Emma appeared at her mother's side, small face serious beyond her years. Mama, are you having the baby? Rebecca nodded, unable to speak through the pain. Tommy tugged at Jake's sleeve. Is Mama going to die like Papa did? Jake knelt down, eye level with the boy. No, son, your Mama's going to be fine. But I need you and Emma to be brave, just like last night. Can you do that? Both children nodded solemnly. Another volley of shots peppered the cabin. Jake moved to the window, returning fire with controlled precision. Each shot counted. Ammunition was limited, and Kane's men seemed to have plenty. They're moving closer, Jake muttered, working the rifle's lever, getting ready for a rush. Rebecca straightened as the contraction passed, her hand finding the shotgun. How long between attacks? What? The pains. How long between them? Jake understood immediately. 20 minutes, maybe more. We have time. But even as he said it, they both heard the sound that chilled their blood. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast around the cabin's perimeter. They're circling, Jake said, moving from window to window, trying to find our blind spots. Rebecca breathed through another contraction, shorter than the last. Jake. He heard the fear in her voice and was beside her instantly. 15 minutes, she whispered. The attack came from 3 sides at once. Kane's men had positioned themselves in the trees, creating a crossfire that forced Jake to stay low and move constantly. The mountain man's training served him well. He used the cabin's angles, the thick log walls, even the shadows cast by the dim morning light to his advantage. But there were too many of them. A bullet shattered the remaining glass in the east window. Another punched through the door, splintering wood near where Emma crouched with her brother. Jake fired back, his shots careful and deadly accurate. 2 men fell, but more kept coming. "Rebecca!" Kane's voice cut through the gunfire. "This is your last chance, or come out now, or we burn you out." Rebecca gripped the shotgun tighter, her breathing coming in short gasps as another contraction built. "Don't answer him," Jake said, reloading quickly. But Kane wasn't waiting for an answer. The smell of smoke began to drift through the cabin. They were setting fire to the woodpile against the back wall. "The roof," Jake muttered, looking up at the ceiling. "They're going to torch the roof." He moved to the back room, scanning the walls for options. The smoke was getting thicker, and Rebecca could hear the crackle of flames outside. 10 minutes, she gasped, doubled over again. Jake made a decision. He grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Rebecca called after him. "To end this." His voice was cold as mountain stone. "Before that baby comes into a world on fire." "Jake, no!" But he was already moving, yanking away the barricade with desperate strength. He threw open the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. "Kane!" he roared. "This is between you and me. Leave them out of it." The shooting stopped. Kane emerged from the trees, his wounded arm in a makeshift sling, a revolver in his good hand. "Jake Morgan," Kane said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "finally decided to face me like a man." "Call off your dogs," Jake said, rifle trained on Kane's chest. "Fight me clean. Winner takes all." Kane laughed. "You think I'm stupid? You always were the better shot." "Then you're a coward as well as a killer." Kane's face darkened. "Am I?" He raised his voice. "Boys, light it up." Torches flew from the trees, landing on the cabin's roof with dull thuds. Flames began to lick at the dry shingles. Jake didn't hesitate. He fired and Kane dove for cover. The mountain man was already moving, using the porch post for protection as he worked the rifle's lever. Inside the cabin, Rebecca felt the labor intensifying. The contractions were coming faster now, and the smoke was getting thicker. She could hear the children coughing. "Emma," she called, "the root cellar. Take Tommy and get under the floorboards." "I'm not leaving you, Mama." "Yes, you are." Rebecca's voice carried all the authority of motherhood. "Take your brother and go." Now, reluctantly, Emma led Tommy to the hidden cellar door, lifting the boards that Jake had loosened days before. They disappeared into the earth just as part of the roof collapsed, sending sparks and burning timber crashing down. Outside, the gunfight continued. Jake had taken cover behind the woodpile, trading shots with Kane's men, but he was outnumbered, and they all knew it. Rebecca crawled toward the window, shotgun in hand. Through the smoke and flame, she could see Jake pinned down, unable to move without exposing himself to crossfire. She made her own decision. Fighting through another contraction, she rose to her feet and stepped toward the burning doorway. "Kane," she shouted, "you want me? Here I am." The mountain man looked back in horror. "Rebecca, get back inside." But she was already on the porch, shotgun leveled at the nearest gunman. She fired, and the man spun away into the trees. "The gold doesn't exist," she called to Kane. "My husband had nothing but his family." Kane stepped into the open, revolver raised. "Then you'll die for nothing, just like he did." Rebecca worked the shotgun's action, chambering another round. But before either of them could fire, a new sound cut through the air, the crack of Jake's rifle. Kane staggered, clutching his chest. He looked down at the spreading red stain with something like surprise. "Told you I was the better shot," Jake said quietly. Kane fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the snow. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader down, melted back into the trees like smoke. The sound of retreating horses echoed off the canyon walls. Jake ran to Rebecca, catching her as her knees buckled. The contraction that gripped her now was different, deeper, more insistent. "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming now." Together, they stumbled back into the smoking cabin. Jake called for the children, and Emma's head appeared from the cellar opening. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," Jake confirmed, helping Rebecca to the cot. "But we've got a new arrival coming." As if summoned by his words, Rebecca cried out as the strongest contraction yet seized her. Jake moved with calm efficiency, gathering clean cloth, water, anything that might help. I don't know how to do this, Rebecca panted. You do, Jake said firmly. Your body knows. Trust it. The labor was hard and fast, intensified by fear, smoke, and the adrenaline of battle. But as the sun broke through the morning clouds, filling the damaged cabin with golden light, a new cry joined the mountain wind. Strong, healthy, angry at being born into such chaos. Jake wrapped the baby, a girl, in his own shirt and placed her in Rebecca's arms. The child had dark hair like her mother and lungs that could wake the dead. She's beautiful, Emma whispered, emerging fully from the cellar with Tommy close behind. What will you name her? Tommy asked. Rebecca looked at Jake, at this mountain man who'd saved her life not once but twice, who'd stood between her family and death without hesitation. Clara, she said softly. Her name is Clara. Jake's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. Clara Morgan, he said, and something in the way he said it made it sound like a promise. Rebecca looked at him sharply. Morgan? Jake knelt beside the cot, his weathered hand gentle on the baby's head. If you'll have us, he said quietly, all of us, as a family. Outside, snow began to fall at last, covering the signs of battle, washing the mountain clean. Inside the wounded cabin, a new family drew their first breaths together, and Rebecca Coleman realized that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with guns and bullets. They're fought with love, courage, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth any price to protect. The snow fell for 3 days after Clara's birth, covering the scorch marks on the cabin walls and filling in the boot prints left by Cain's men. It was as if the mountain itself was healing, washing away the violence and making room for something new. Rebecca lay on the cot with Clara nestled against her chest, watching Jake rebuild what the fire had damaged. He worked with quiet determination, replacing burned roof beams and patching bullet holes with the same patient care he'd once used to carve toys from pine. His movements were different now, less guarded, more settled, like a man who'd finally found his place. Emma and Tommy had taken to the baby with the fierce protectiveness of older siblings. Emma sang lullabies she half remembered from before their father died, and Tommy appointed himself guardian of Clara's sleep, shushing anyone who spoke too loudly near the cradle Jake had fashioned from birch and lined with soft rabbit fur. She's so small, Tommy whispered one morning, reaching out to touch Clara's tiny fist. Was I ever that small? Rebecca smiled, pulling him close. Smaller, if you can believe it. Jake paused in his work, hammer in hand, watching the 3 children with something like wonder in his eyes. Hard to imagine, he said softly. You being small. It was becoming a habit, these quiet moments between them. The desperate urgency of survival had given way to something deeper. Stolen glances across the cabin, hands brushing as they passed each other, conversations that said more in their silences than in their words. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep and the fire burned low, Rebecca found Jake sitting on the repaired porch, whittling a small wooden horse. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. For Clara? She asked, settling beside him despite the chill. For Tommy, actually. Jake's knife moved in smooth, practiced strokes. Figured he might like having something that's his alone. Being the man of the house is hard work for someone so young. Rebecca studied his profile in the starlight, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the gentle concentration on his face as he worked. Is that what you were? The man of the house? Jake's hand stilled. My father died when I was 8, mountain fever. Left me with my mother and 2 sisters. He resumed carving, but his voice carried the weight of old sorrow. I wasn't much good at it back then. What happened to them? Sickness took my mother the winter I turned 15. My sisters went to live with our aunt in Denver. Jake's jaw tightened. I wasn't ready to be responsible for anyone, so I ran. Rebecca understood then why he'd left her that night 10 years ago, why he'd hidden in the mountains instead of building a life. You were just a boy, old enough to know I was failing them. He looked at her then, and in his eyes was a pain that had softened but never fully healed. I've been running from that feeling ever since. And now, Jake set down the carving and turned to face her fully. Now I know the difference between running from responsibility and running toward it. His hand found hers, rough fingers intertwining with hers. I want to be the man Tommy thinks I am, the father Clara deserves, the husband you need. The word hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Rebecca felt her heart flutter, not with fear, but with something she'd thought died with her first husband. Jake, she whispered. I know it's too soon, he said quickly. I know you're still healing, still grieving. But I need you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. Rebecca studied his face in the moonlight. This mountain man who'd saved her life twice over, who'd stood between her children and death without hesitation, who carved wooden toys by firelight and sang lullabies in a voice rough as bark, but gentle as rain. I was 18 when I married Daniel, she said finally, young and foolish and so sure I knew what love was. She looked down at their joined hands. He was a good man, a kind man. But what I feel for you? Jake waited, not breathing. It's different, she continued, deeper, like it was always there, waiting. She met his eyes. I think I started loving you the night you carried me to safety. I just didn't understand it then. Jake's hand tightened around hers. Rebecca. Yes, she said simply. When I'm ready. When the morning is done. Yes. He kissed her then, soft and reverent, like a prayer answered. When they broke apart, both were crying, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of two people who'd been lost and finally found their way home. The winter deepened, but inside the cabin, warmth reigned. Jake taught Emma to track animals in the snow, showed her how to read the mountain's moods in the color of the sky and the behavior of birds. Tommy learned to split kindling and set snares, his small chest puffing with pride every time he successfully caught a rabbit. Rebecca grew stronger each day, her body healing from Clara's birth and her heart learning to hold joy again. She watched Jake with her children, patient, kind, never raising his voice even when Tommy knocked over a week's worth of carved figures, or Emma accidentally let the fire die down to coals. One morning in February, she woke to find Jake gone and the children giggling secretively over something hidden beneath a quilt. Clara gurgled in her cradle, tiny fists waving at dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Where did he go? Rebecca asked, suspicious of their barely contained excitement. Can't tell, Emma said, grinning. It's a surprise. Jake returned near noon, stomping snow from his boots and carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth. He set it carefully on the table and stepped back, suddenly shy. What is it? Rebecca asked. Open it, Tommy urged, bouncing on his toes. Rebecca unwrapped the cloth to reveal a music box, clearly handmade but exquisitely crafted. The wood was polished to a warm glow, and when she lifted the lid, a tiny wooden couple danced to a melody that sounded like wind chimes and running water. Jake, she breathed, it's beautiful. How did you? Been working on it since Clara was born, he said, color rising in his cheeks. Figured every little girl should have music in her life. Rebecca ran her fingers over the intricate carving, roses and vines that seemed to grow from the wood itself. The tune. It's the song my mother used to sing, Jake said quietly. The only one I remember. Emma clapped her hands together. Play it again. As the music box played its gentle melody, Rebecca felt something break open inside her chest, not painfully, but like ice melting in spring sunshine. This man who'd spent years running from love had crafted something so beautiful, so full of hope and promise, that she could barely speak. That night, after the children were asleep and Clara lay peaceful in her cradle, Rebecca found Jake by the fire, reading from an old book of poems. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat from his body. The music box, she said. It's not just for Clara, is it? Jake closed the book, marking his place with a finger. No, he admitted. It's for all of us, for the family we're becoming. Rebecca took the book from his hands and set it aside. Then she turned to face him fully, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jake Morgan, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. Will you marry me? His eyes widened. Rebecca, I should be the one. I'm not asking because it's proper, she interrupted. I'm asking because I love you, because you've given me back my life, my hope, my future, because I want to wake up every morning knowing you're mine and I'm yours." Jake cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she didn't know she'd shed. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Jake's smile was brighter than the fire, warmer than spring sunshine. "Then yes, Rebecca Coleman. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll be Tommy's father, and Emma's father, and Clara's father. Yes, I'll build you a life worth living." They made love that night for the first time, gentle and reverent in front of the dying fire, while snow whispered against the windows and their children slept safe and sound. It was nothing like the desperate coupling of her youth. This was two souls finding completion, two hearts beating in perfect rhythm, two people who'd been lost and broken finding wholeness in each other's arms. Later, as Rebecca lay with her head on Jake's chest and his arms around her, she listened to the steady beat of his heart and thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that terrified girl bleeding behind a burned chapel to the woman who'd bought a mountain man for $1 and found love beyond measure. "What are you thinking about?" Jake murmured, his voice rough with sleep and contentment. "Miracles," Rebecca said softly, "and how sometimes they come disguised as the thing you need most, even when you don't know you need it." Jake's arms tightened around her. "What was it you needed most?" Rebecca smiled against his chest. "A man who would stay." Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, and inside the cabin, 4 hearts beat in harmony, plus one tiny one learning the rhythm of love from the very beginning. Spring was still months away, but in that moment Rebecca could feel it coming. The thaw, the green growth, the endless possibility of new life. They would plant a garden together, she and Jake. They would watch their children grow tall and strong. They would build something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of their separate sorrows. And somewhere in the distance, if she listened carefully, Rebecca thought she could hear the future calling their names, not with the desperation of survival, but with the sweet promise of home. Spring came early to the mountains that year, arriving not with fanfare but with quiet insistence. The snow melted in patches, revealing mud and new grass, and the promise of wildflowers to come. Ice broke free from the creek with musical crashes, and the air carried the scent of pine sap and possibility. Rebecca stood on the rebuilt porch, Clara sleeping in her arms, watching Jake teach Tommy how to fish in the rushing water below. Emma sat nearby, weaving wildflowers into a crown with the patient concentration she'd inherited from her mother. The sight filled Rebecca with a contentment so complete it almost frightened her. They'd set the wedding for June, when the mountain laurel would be in bloom, and the weather warm enough for a celebration. Jake had ridden down to the valley twice, bringing back a preacher's promise to make the journey up to their cabin, along with fabric for a dress and sugar for a proper cake. "Mama," Emma said, looking up from her flower crown, "will Jake really be our papa after you get married?" Rebecca smiled. "He already is, sweetheart. The ceremony just makes it official." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Can I call him Papa now? I think he'd like that very much." Down by the creek, Tommy let out a whoop of joy as his line went taut. Jake helped him land a trout almost as long as the boy's arm, both of them whooping and laughing like children. The sound carried up to the cabin, and Rebecca felt her heart swell with something close to perfect happiness, which was why she noticed immediately when Jake's laughter died. He stood frozen in the creek, water rushing around his boots, his eyes fixed on something beyond the trees. Tommy followed his gaze, and his small face went pale. Rebecca set Clara in her cradle and stepped to the edge of the porch. "Jake?" He was already moving, splashing through the water toward them. "Inside," he said quietly. "All of you. Now." Rebecca herded the children into the cabin, her pulse quickening. Through the window, she watched Jake retrieve his rifle from behind the woodpile, checking the load with movements made automatic by too much practice. "What is it?" she asked when he joined them. "Ryder," Jake said simply, "coming up the South Trail." Emma pressed close to her mother's side. "Is it the bad men again?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. He moved to the window, rifle ready but not raised. "But we'll be ready either way." The rider appeared 20 minutes later, a lone figure on a black horse, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who didn't fear ambush. He was tall and lean, dressed in clothes too fine for mountain travel, with pale hair that caught the afternoon light. Jake's face went hard as Winterstone. Son of a bitch. You know him? Rebecca asked. Marcus Kane, Jake said grimly. Emmett's younger brother. Rebecca felt ice form in her stomach. What does he want? Same thing Emmett wanted. Different reasons. Marcus Kane rode to within shouting distance and stopped, hands visible and empty. He was younger than his dead brother, maybe 30, with the kind of cold, pretty features that hid a snake's nature. Jake Morgan, he called, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. I've come to talk. Jake opened the door but stayed behind the frame. Talk then, face to face, like men do. I can hear you fine from here. Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Still the careful one. That's what kept you alive in Silverton, wasn't it? Jake didn't answer. My brother's dead, Marcus continued conversationally. Found his body when the snow melted. You remember Emmett, don't you? My older brother who taught me to shoot, to track, to never let a debt go unpaid? Your brother was a killer and a coward, Jake called back. He got what he deserved. Maybe so. Marcus shifted in his saddle, still smiling that cold smile. But you see, Jake, there's the matter of honor. Family honor. Emmett might have been a bastard, but he was my bastard, and the Kane name means something in this territory. Rebecca moved to the window beside Jake, Clara in her arms. Marcus's eyes found her immediately and his smile widened. And you must be the lovely widow, he said with mocking courtesy. Rebecca Coleman, isn't it? Soon to be Rebecca Morgan, if the gossip is true. Leave her out of this, Jake growled. Oh, but I can't do that, Marcus replied. You see, Emmett told me all about your little family before he rode up here. How you'd gone soft, gotten yourself attached to a woman and her children. Made you vulnerable, he said. Jake raised his rifle slightly. Say what you came to say. Marcus pulled a piece of paper from his coat, unfolding it with theatrical care. This is a warrant signed by Judge Harrison in Denver. Seems there's still the matter of that bank robbery in Silverton. Emmett might be dead, but the law has a long memory. Rebecca's blood chilled. Is it real? Jake's jaw worked. Probably, but it doesn't matter. Oh, but it does, Marcus said cheerfully. Because you see, I'm a deputy marshal now. Have been for 2 years. Which means I can arrest you legally, haul you down to Denver for trial, and leave your pretty family here to fend for themselves. He leaned forward in his saddle. Unless, of course, you want to settle this the old-fashioned way. Man to man, guns drawn, winner walks away. Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady as stone. And if I win, the warrant disappears. I ride away and never come back. And if you win, Marcus's smile turned predatory. Then I take my time with your woman before I put a bullet in her head. Rebecca gasped, and Jake's knuckles went white around the rifle stock. You bastard, Jake snarled. Do we have a deal? Jake looked at Rebecca, at Tommy and Emma huddled together by the fire, at baby Clara sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. Everything he'd found, everything he'd built, everything he loved in one small cabin on a mountain that had become home. We have a deal, he said quietly. No! Rebecca grabbed his arm. Jake, you can't. He'll kill you. Jake turned to her, his eyes full of a love so deep it took her breath away. I won't let him hurt you. Any of you. Not ever. He kissed her then, hard and desperate and full of promises he might not live to keep. When he pulled away, his hands framed her face. Whatever happens out there, you take the children and run. There's a cave behind the waterfall, 2 miles north. Food cached there, blankets. Wait 3 days, then head for the valley. I'm not leaving you. You are, Jake said firmly, because if something happens to me, they'll need their mother. He kissed Clara's forehead, ruffled Tommy's hair, and squeezed Emma's hand. Then he walked out the door, rifle in hand, toward the man who wanted to destroy everything he'd fought to build. Marcus had dismounted and was checking his revolver with the casual confidence of a man who'd never lost a gunfight. He was fast. Rebecca could see it in the way he moved, the loose-limbed grace of a natural killer. But Jake was something else entirely. He was deliberate, focused, moving with the patient lethality of a mountain cat. This wasn't the desperate boy who'd rob banks to survive. This was a man protecting his family. The two men faced each other across 30 yards of muddy ground. The afternoon sun slanted between the trees, casting long shadows and turning the clearing into a natural arena. "Any last words, Morgan?" Marcus called. Jake's answer was simple. "I'm not the same man I was in Silverton." Marcus laughed. "We'll see about that." They drew together, two guns clearing leather in the same heartbeat. But where Marcus was fast, Jake was sure. The mountain man's shot took Marcus' center chest, spinning him around before he hit the ground. Jake walked forward slowly, rifle ready, but there was no need. Marcus Kane lay still, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the sky he'd never see again. Jake stood over the body for a long moment, then turned and walked back to the cabin. Rebecca met him at the door, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," he said simply. "For good this time." She threw herself into his arms, and he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Behind them, the children pressed close, and even baby Clara seemed to sense that something important had ended. That night, Jake burned Marcus Kane's warrant in the fire while Rebecca watched. The flames consumed the last legal threat to their happiness, turning it to ash and smoke. "What now?" she asked. Jake pulled her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Now we live," he said. "We get married, we raise our children, we build something beautiful and lasting and good. And the past? The past is dead and buried." Jake's voice was quiet but certain. "I'm not running anymore, Rebecca. Not from anything. This is where I belong. Here, with you, with them." Outside, spring rain began to fall, washing the blood from the earth and filling the mountain streams with fresh, clean water. Inside the cabin, a family gathered around the fire, safe and whole and ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Because some storms pass and some wounds heal, and sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you get to start over with the people who matter most. The mountain man had found his home at last, and this time nothing would drive him away. June came to the mountains with an explosion of wildflowers, and the kind of warm, golden light that made even the hardest places look like something from a fairy tale. Rebecca stood before the cracked mirror in the cabin, adjusting the simple white dress Jake had brought from the valley. Cotton with tiny pearl buttons and lace at the collar, nothing fancy but beautiful in its simplicity. Emma fussed with her mother's hair, weaving mountain laurel blossoms through the auburn waves with the serious concentration of a child given an important task. In the corner, Tommy practiced walking in his new boots, while Clara gurgled contentedly in her cradle, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight. "You look like a princess, Mama," Emma said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Rebecca smiled, touching the flowers in her hair. "I feel like one." Outside, she could hear Jake's voice mixing with that of Reverend Porter, who'd made the long journey up from the valley to perform the ceremony. The preacher was a kind man with gentle eyes who'd ask no uncomfortable questions about their past, focusing instead on the future they were building together. A soft knock came at the door. "Rebecca?" Jake's voice was nervous, almost shy. "The Reverend's ready when you are." She opened the door to find her husband-to-be standing on the threshold, and her breath caught in her throat. Jake wore a black suit, borrowed from the Reverend who was close to his size, and he'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair. But it was his eyes that made her heart skip. They were bright with joy and wonder, like a man who couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "You're beautiful," he said softly. "So are you," she replied, and meant it. They'd chosen to hold the ceremony on the porch, with the mountains as their cathedral and the afternoon breeze as their organ music. Reverend Porter stood between them, his Bible open to the passage about love, being patient and kind. Tommy and Emma flanked their parents, trying hard to stand still and look grown up. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice carrying across the clearing, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jacob Morgan and Rebecca Coleman in holy matrimony." Rebecca barely heard the familiar words. She was lost in Jake's eyes, in the promise she saw there, in the miracle of this moment. A year ago, she'd been a desperate widow walking through snow with two hungry children and no hope. Now she stood in sunlight, surrounded by love, about to marry a man who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved. Jacob, Reverend Porter said, do you take Rebecca to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? Jake's voice was steady as mountain stone. I do. Rebecca, do you take Jacob to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? She thought of the dollars she'd paid for this man, the best investment of her life. I do. The rings? Tommy stepped forward importantly, carrying the two simple gold bands Jake had carved from ore he'd panned from the creek. They weren't perfect. The mountain man was better with wood than metal, but they were made with love, and that made them priceless. Jake slipped the ring onto Rebecca's finger with hands that trembled slightly. With this ring, I thee wed. Rebecca's hands were steady as she placed his ring. With this ring, I thee wed. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, Reverend Porter pronounced, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Jake cupped Rebecca's face in his hands and kissed her with all the tenderness of a man who'd waited a lifetime for this moment. Around them, the mountains themselves seemed to celebrate. Birds sang in the trees, wind chimes made from shell casings tinkled in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried its approval to the sky. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. They shared a cake Rebecca had baked that morning, sweet with wild honey and studded with berries. Jake played his harmonica while Emma danced, and Tommy tried to teach Clara to clap in rhythm. Reverend Porter told stories of other mountain weddings he'd performed, each one a testament to love's ability to bloom in the hardest places. As evening approached and the Reverend prepared to ride back to the valley, he pulled Jake aside. You've got something special here, the preacher said quietly. Don't take it for granted. Jake looked at his new wife, at the children who were now legally his, at the cabin that had become a home. Never, he said, not for a single day. After the Reverend left, the family settled on the porch to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Clara slept in Rebecca's arms while Tommy and Emma leaned against Jake's sides, drowsy from excitement and cake. What happens now? Emma asked sleepily. Rebecca and Jake exchanged a look over the children's heads. They talked about this, planned for it during the long winter nights. Now we build something bigger, Rebecca said. Something important. Like what? Tommy asked. Jake's voice was thoughtful. Your mom and I have been thinking about women like she was, alone, scared, with nowhere to go. We want to help them. How? Rebecca stroked Clara's soft hair. By opening our home, by letting them know there's a place where they can be safe while they figure out what comes next. It had been Rebecca's idea, born from her own desperate journey through the snow. She remembered the kindness of strangers who'd shared their fire, their food, their hope. Now she wanted to be that kindness for others. We'll start small, Jake added. One woman at a time, one family at a time. Build trust, build community. Like a real town? Emma asked, perking up. Maybe someday, Rebecca said, if that's what's needed. Over the following weeks, their plan began to take shape. Jake expanded the cabin, adding 2 more rooms and a larger kitchen. Rebecca wrote letters to churches and women's groups in distant towns, letting them know about the sanctuary they were building. Word spread quietly, carefully, through networks of women who understood desperation and the need for hope. The first to arrive was Sarah Beth, a young woman barely out of her teens, carrying a baby and fleeing a husband who used his fists more than his words. She stayed 2 weeks, long enough to rest and plan, before Jake helped her reach relatives in California. Then came Martha, an older woman whose children had grown and whose husband had died, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. She stayed longer, helping Rebecca with the younger children and bringing a steady, calming presence to the household. Each woman who passed through left something behind: recipes, stories, skills, hope. And each took something with her: strength, confidence, the knowledge that she wasn't alone in the world. By autumn, what had started as a single cabin had grown into a small community. There were 6 buildings now, scattered through the trees like a village designed by nature itself. A workshop where Jake taught carpentry and metalwork. A garden where Rebecca and the other women grew vegetables and herbs. A schoolhouse where Emma had started teaching the younger children to read. One evening in October, as the aspen leaves turned gold and the air carried the first hint of winter, Rebecca stood on the original porch with Clara on her hip, watching Jake teach Tommy how to shoe a horse. Around them, the community hummed with quiet activity, women preparing dinner, children playing in the last light, the sound of hammers and saws as homes were built and lives were reconstructed. "Penny for your thoughts," Jake said, appearing beside her with arms that still took her breath away. "Just thinking about journeys," Rebecca replied, leaning into his warmth. "How you never know where they'll lead." Jake followed her gaze across their growing settlement. "Any regrets about yours?" Rebecca thought about the woman who'd stood in that distant town a year ago, desperate and alone, clutching a single dollar and hoping for a miracle. That woman could never have imagined this. The love, the family, the purpose, the home that stretched beyond 4 walls to encompass an entire community of healing hearts. "Not one," she said firmly. That night, after the children were asleep and the settlement had grown quiet, Rebecca and Jake sat by their fire, Clara nursing peacefully while they planned the future. There would be challenges ahead: winter to survive, more women to help, a community to nurture and grow. But they would face it all together, bound by love and strengthened by purpose. "I have something for you," Jake said suddenly, reaching behind his chair to produce a small wooden box, carved with the same intricate detail as Clara's music box. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a compass, but not just any compass. This one was engraved with their initials and the date of their wedding, its needle pointing not north, but to a small heart carved in the center. "So you'll always know which way leads home," Jake said softly. Rebecca traced the engraving with her finger, tears blurring her vision. "I already know that," she whispered. "Home isn't a direction. It's wherever you are." Outside, snow began to fall, the first of many storms they would weather together. But inside their cabins, surrounded by the sleeping sounds of their children and the steady tick of time moving forward, 2 people who had found each other against all odds settled into the kind of love that builds empires from single dollars and creates legacies from acts of simple kindness. The woman who had bought a stranger for survival had discovered something far more valuable than she'd ever dared dream. She'd found love, family, purpose, and a future bright with possibility. And in the mountains of Colorado, where winter winds sang lullabies and spring always returned with wildflowers, the legend of Rebecca and Jake Morgan was just beginning, one rescued heart at a time. And so, across these wild mountains, another tale finds its home in the wind. The story of Rebecca Coleman reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the simplest decisions: a dollar spent in desperation, a hand extended in kindness, a heart willing to trust when trust seems impossible. She walked into that forgotten town as a broken woman, carrying nothing but children and sorrow. She left as something else entirely, a beacon of hope for every soul who's ever believed they were beyond saving. Jake Morgan found his redemption not in the solitude of mountain peaks, but in the courage to stop running from love. The boy who'd fled responsibility became the man who embraced it completely. The outlaw who'd once taken what wasn't his learned to give everything he had. And in the end, the mountain man discovered that the greatest wilderness to conquer wasn't made of stone and snow. It was the fear of letting someone else call you home. Their legacy lived on long after the snows claimed them. The settlement they built grew into a town, and that town became a sanctuary known throughout the territory. Women traveled hundreds of miles to reach that place where broken things were mended, where stories could begin again, where a dollar's worth of faith could transform into a lifetime of love. The cabin still stands today, they say. Not the original logs, perhaps, but the foundation, the spirit, the promise that echoes through every board and beam. Visitors come seeking the secret of the dollar bride, hoping to understand how desperation became devotion, how survival became sanctuary, how one woman's last dollar became the first investment in a love that changed everything. But Rebecca would tell you there was no secret, no magic formula for the impossible. There was only this: The willingness to see past fear, to hope, past ending to beginning, past the price tag to the priceless treasure of a heart that's learned to trust again. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fanfare and flowers. Sometimes it comes quiet as snow, patient as stone, steady as the mountains themselves. In a world that often mistakes loudness for strength and speed for progress, the story of Rebecca and Jake whispers a different truth, that the most powerful force in creation is the decision to stay, to build, to nurture what matters most when everything around you says to run. They chose each other not once but every day, through gunfire and labor pains, through doubt and sorrow, through the thousand small moments that either tear love apart or weave it stronger. Their children grew tall and proud, carrying forward the lesson that family isn't just blood and law. It's the daily choice to see someone else's happiness as essential to your own. Emma became a teacher who opened schools across 3 states. Tommy grew into a man who never forgot the mountain wisdom of his adopted father. And Clara, sweet Clara born in the chaos of battle, became a doctor who spent her life healing others the way her parents had healed each other. The compass Jake carved for Rebecca was passed down through generations, its needle still pointing not to magnetic north, but to the carved heart at its center. Because home, as Rebecca learned, isn't a place on any map. It's the collection of heartbeats that matter most to yours. It's the voice that calls your name with joy instead of judgment. It's the arms that catch you when you fall and hold you tight enough to believe you're worth saving. If you've ever felt like you were walking through winter with nothing left to spend, remember Rebecca Coleman. If you've ever thought you were too broken for love, too scared for trust, too lost for saving, remember the mountain man who bought hope for $1 and sold it for nothing because he'd learned the secret of true wealth. Some transactions can't be measured in currency. Some investments pay dividends for generations. Some purchases, like love, like family, like the courage to start over, are worth every penny you have and more valuable than anything money can buy. Have you ever made a desperate decision that changed your life? Ever trusted a stranger when trust seemed impossible? Share your story of unexpected hope in the comments below, because every heart has its own version of the Dollar Bride's journey, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones we tell each other. If this tale of mountain courage and unshakable love touched something in your soul, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of grit, grace, and the unbreakable bonds that make us human. Until the next trail leads us home, remember, love isn't something you find. It's something you choose, something you build, something you invest in every single day. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, the best investment you'll ever make costs exactly $1 and changes absolutely everything. This is Wild West Stories. Thank you for riding with us through the mountains of the heart